As the energy sector. My name's Howie Hawkins. I'm in the Green Party, but this is an issue I've been working on since I was in the Clamshell Alliance and actually before in the 1970s. And we really have an all-star panel to address this issue. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're speaking and tell you a little bit about them at the beginning. And then I'm going to try to set the issue up briefly, and then at the end I'm going to report on some more recent movements for socializing the energy sector. So the first two speakers will be Leonard Rodberg and Charles Komanoff, who have been producing papers on energy issues since the 1970s. And actually they've been producing policy papers on other issues. Leonard has been, he was involved in the Dellum's Health Service Bill and the single payer movement, and he does a lot of other things like that. Charles is also involved in transportation alternatives as well as energy policy. So Leonard Rodberg is chair of the Urban Studies program at Queens College, and he's going to speak on clean energy technologies that are now available and how they relate to the question of energy democracy. And Charles, who set up the Carbon Tax Center and also, I guess, refounded the Transportation Alternatives Group, is going to talk about the carbon tax and dividend proposal, including how border taxes may internationalize the carbon tax regime and the whole question of energy democracy. And Leonard's on the far right and Charles is on the far left on the panel, or my left and right. And then Jill Stein, who's to my right, was the Green Party presidential candidate in 2012. And she was recently in Norway, where Greens and environmentalists have been protesting the pro-fossil fuel policies of Statoil, a state-owned oil company. So she's going to talk about what that may mean for social ownership and democratic control, as well as some issues going on in Massachusetts. And then to my immediate left is Sean Sweeney, who directs the Global Labor Institute and is involved in an international initiative called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. And he's going to report on that. So after the presentations, we'll have comments and question and answer, and I'll take 5 or so and then let the panel respond, and we'll go around like that. And I'll ask you to limit your comments and questions to 2 minutes. And I got a little clock here, so I'll keep track. So let me just briefly set up the issue. You know, the question is it time to raise this demand, socialize the energy sector? And there are a lot of tactical and strategic organizing considerations that go into that question. But to set up the issues, I just want to talk about why it may be an absolutely necessary demand, a necessary condition for reducing carbon emissions sufficiently to avert catastrophic climate change. Many of you are probably familiar with the article that got wide distribution last summer from Bill McKibben and Rolling Stone called Global Warming's Terrifying New Math. And he had some magic numbers, 3 of them. First one was 2 degrees Celsius. That is the tipping point that scientists have said, we go beyond that and climate change may become runaway. And most of the governments of the world have accepted that as a goal, although the action following up on that goal is notably limiting. The second number was 565 gigatons carbon emissions. And that is the threshold of a global carbon budget above which the scientists believe will go shooting past that 2 degrees centigrade. And the third number was 2,795 gigatons. That is the amount of proven fossil fuel reserves that we have, and they were worth market value last summer of $27 trillion. So the question is there any way of keeping 80% of those fossil fuels in the ground? 565 of 2795 is right about at 20%, which means that's all the carbon budget we can release. So the question is there any way when we have profit maximizing corporations, whether they're private or state-owned, is there any way they're going to walk away from basically $20 trillion of revenue unless we take them over and give them a different mission? So that's the basic issue, but there's some issues that flow from that. The question of democracy. Without democratic control and we still may end up with fossil fuel extraction. What's the mission? Is it for profit or public benefit? And the other issue would be, what is the relation of, if we start raising demand, socialize the energy sector, how does it relate to other demands of the climate action movement, like the carbon tax, which is probably the most prominent And so those are the kinds of issues we're going to talk about on this panel today. So the first speaker is Leonard Rodberg. And why don't you come up here so the mic, and then when we're answering questions, we've got to use that mic on the table there.
Thank you. I'm happy and actually surprised to be talking about this. I teach, as Howie said, I teach urban studies at Queens College. I teach health policy and I teach climate change. My background is as a theoretical physicist. And I worked on disarmament in the 1960s and on energy issues in the 1970s when it became, partly because of the environmental movement, Earth Day in 1970, and the so-called energy crisis in 1973 when the Arab oil embargo arose. But I haven't written on these issues other than their employment impact in many, many years. And Howie somehow had noticed, remembered a series of articles I wrote in the 70s and the Village Voice in 1980, in which I presented an energy plan, an alternate energy plan for New York City. And he sent me an email reminding me that I had done this and saying, would I talk about why I did it and what the context was. So that's what I'm going to do, very briefly. The 60s are thought of and remembered for many things, the women's movement, civil rights movement, but also for the growth in a phenomenon that goes under various names, participatory democracy or local democracy, and it was actually embodied in a number of federal government actions, including the creation and funding of community development corporations, community health centers, the neighborhood anti-poverty groups in which the maximum feasible participation of the local populace was mandated by federal law. And I was initially not part of that. I was initially working on disarmament in the State Department. But by the end of the decade, I was very closely working on it in a think tank that was created in the 60s called the Institute for Policy Studies, which still exists. And one of the areas we worked on ran under the title of economic alternatives, ways of conceiving of the economy running in a way that would be consonant with those ideas of local democracy. But also, since I'd worked on disarmament and the founders of the Institute, Dick Barnett and Mark Raskin, had also been engaged in anti-war activities. Also, how do we create an economy that doesn't depend on military spending, clearly to maintain anything approaching full employment? Clearly, we have not solved that problem. Gar Alperovitz was one of the people actively working on that, and he's giving a number of talks around this weekend at this conference. So one of the things I did, the first concrete thing I did in this area was to develop a health bill, the Dellums Health Service Act, which Ron Dellums introduced in 1977, and which his successor, he was representative of Berkeley and Oakland, his successor, Barbara Lee, has entered into the Congress every session until I think this one. And what it did was embody a model of an economic sector which is democratically controlled. My model for it does exist in this world, and it's in Cuba. It's based on the Cuban health system, although it was also based on American inventions, the community health center, the community-controlled community health center. Federal funds going to community health centers will only go if that health center is controlled by a board composed of people who use the center, the local community. And the model works in a health center. It works in the health sector. It, of course, hasn't been, the legislation, of course, hasn't passed. I'm part of the Physicians for a National Health Program, which advocates a much weaker version single-payer national health insurance plan. But the model works. That is, because healthcare compared to energy is very simple. It's doctors and hospitals. And the model, I can give you the structure very simply. At the community level, it's outpatient care. It's ambulatory care run by doctors. But overseen by a board in the Dellums bill, overseen by a board composed of 2/3 of the users of the health facilities and 1/3 the people who work in it, a community worker management board. Above that are hospitals, first level of general community hospitals, and then specialized tertiary hospitals, and finally a national board that licenses physicians and so on. So it's a model that works in an area that is simple, but also, of course, is very large. It's 16%. It's a sixth of the American economy today. And so when we talk about it, we're talking about something that has serious economic impact, but in fact is conceptually workable. And many countries have parts of it, and this country has 800 community health centers that embody the principles that are embodied in it. Now, the same model is laid out in several articles and book chapters that were written during the 1970s, mostly by James Ridgway, who was also at the Institute for Policy Studies and at its successor that he and I and others created called the Public Resource Center. Those articles and chapters are available on Howie Hawkins' website. That is scanned copies of them. And they attempt to provide the same model for the energy sector. That is a local planning and control body that's locally controlled by the populace, by elected officials who run it at the local level, and then the local level creates a higher regional level because energy has to be seen regionally, and finally at the national level. Looking at it now 30 years later, or is it 40 years later, it's much too simple. The energy sector is far more complicated than is the health sector because of the wide variety of resources and the wide variety of geographies where those resources are available. Fossil fuels, of course, are available in certain locations around the world and not others. And they tend to give the locations that have those resources political and economic power. The Northeast tends to be depleted of fossil fuel resources, and the Southwest and other parts, Southwest of the United States and other parts of the world, of course, have them. On the other hand, as Howie said, we have come to realize that we cannot continue to rely on fossil fuels in this century. If we do, by the end of this century, major parts of the eastern seaboard will be underwater. And the rest of the world will be transformed by the rising temperatures of the climate. So this century will see some substantial change in the way we use energy. And this is so fundamental. I don't think people have, I know that the general populace has not understood this yet. Industrial civilization rests on the use of fossil fuels. The Industrial Revolution began with the burning of coal and the realization that you could use steam created from coal to drive turbines, to drive the textile industry of England and create the Industrial Revolution, Germany also. But we must, in this century, get off of fossil fuels onto other sources of energy, renewable sources. Now, those renewable sources are of wide variety and impose a wide variety of demands on us. They range from centralized sources like solar farms, mirrored solar farms in Arizona and New Mexico, to photovoltaics and solar hot water heaters on the roofs of every building in New York City. They are both local, national, and international. And no one governance mechanism will work for them, but governance mechanisms that are accountable to the people, to all of us who need them, are essential and must be created. This is a whole new kind of resource. It's not a resource where you dig it out of the ground in certain places where it exists and then sell it in a market. And it needs special kinds of financing. One of the things I laid out in the Village Voice article is that one of the features of solar cells, well, a combination features of solar or renewable energy is, on the one hand, it's capital intensive. That is, you set up equipment and then it runs. It runs without fuel. That's the whole point of it, is that it uses the natural flow of energy from the sun and converts it into energy we can use, but it requires creating equipment and installing equipment in order to do that. That requires an upfront amount of capital that most of us don't have access to. So you need new ways of financing us so that people can have solar electric put on their roofs. And those mechanisms are being created today. They're being created both by local governments in some parts of this country and in the case of New York City, the government isn't doing it yet, but local leasing firms are. They will install the solar equipment on your roof and let you pay it off basically with the savings that you make from the electricity. But that has to be done on a large scale, and it has to be done under public auspices because it is so varied and it is subject to exploitation. Because we're going to be tenant. We're also going to need an electric grid, which by definition is regional and requires much more than just local governance. So you do need the kind of complex governing structure that Jim Ridgway talks about. That is, you need local governance and local financing to make the capital investments that are needed for renewable energy, but you also need it regionally in order to be able, if we're going to rely on electricity more, which I think is the way the future is going to go, you're going to need to be able to transfer electricity from areas where the wind is blowing to areas where it's not, from areas where the sun is shining to areas where it's not. And that will mean not only local energy sources and work for local workers installing this equipment, but you'll need regional and national networks that need to be governed in the public interest, not in the interest of companies that simply want to exploit resources and exploit us. So we're talking here about a revolution in the kind of energy we use and in the way it's governed, because it is so different. And so it is, by definition, totally, it exists everywhere. Solar energy exists everywhere. Wind exists everywhere. It is not the localized kind of resources that can be controlled by landowners and companies that gain control of those resources. So we need new thinking about the types of energy we're going to use. We need new thinking about how to govern it, and we need new thinking about how to finance it so that it can become a reality. And it has to become a reality, as Bill McKibben showed in his article, and as I've suggested. This century is the century of a new form of energy, a new energy regime, or else civilization as we know it will come to an end. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Here's the clock. I'm going to grab it. Okay? Or,
Well,
no,
I'll grab it, and
we'll,
I'll
no,
let you know when.
we'll share it. Okay?
Yeah, okay.
Bike sharing, clock sharing. So much to say, and not nearly enough time. And actually, Len, you were going to talk about the Mark Jacobson 100% wind, water, sun. And so maybe I'll begin my remarks with that, just a minute or two. And Howie, is that on your website, the
Yes.
Jacobson paper? Great. By a show of hands, if you live in the United States, if that's your primary residence, I just want to sort of see where people are from. Okay, almost all of us. Same question, New York State. Okay, so good. Then this is particularly, thank you, salient. A team of physicists and engineers at Stanford, headed by Mark Jacobson, and that's Jacob, S-O-N. Over the past several years has been researching the capabilities, not the political or cultural or institutional, but the sheer physical capability of the world to get the energy that the world needs to have a kind of OECD level, style of consumption, entirely from wind, water, and sunlight derived resources. And they've concluded that there are no constraints in terms of the magnitude of the resources, the amount of materials that would be needed, and even the costs of this system, especially when the benefits in terms of health, clean air, let alone climate benefits, are accounted for. It's a very powerful set of analyses, and yet it's so global that you can't really wrap your hands and heads around it very easily. Well, 3 months ago, the same team published, or completed, and it's about to be published in a journal called Energy Policy, an article, I forget the title actually, it's a long title, that examines 100% wind, water, sunlight for New York State. And it is on Howie's website. You'll find it there. Here's a typescript of it. And it's both inspiring and also, though perhaps a bit terrifying. The vision, or the goal, is meeting not just the electricity requirements, but the transportation fuels, the liquid fuels, heating, airplanes, driving, etc., entirely through electric sources. And you would oversize the system both to provide the reliability and the dependability you need because of the intermittency of wind and sunlight or natural energy flows, but also to use surplus power and off-peak periods to create hydrogen that would be the fuel for transportation, essentially. I'm going very fast and papering over some important issues. It's quite exciting. What might be scary for some people is the magnitude of the facilities and installations that would be required to provide all of this energy for the state of New York. And so, for example, 40% of this, there's a number of ways you could do it, but in the scenario they've laid out here, 40% of all this energy would come from offshore wind turbines, which I happen to feel terrific about, even having grown up in Long Beach, Long Island, and loving that unobstructed view of the ocean. Well, we're in a different reality right now. But how about 12,700 of them? And just for New York State, there's Massachusetts, Delaware, New Jersey, et cetera. That's 40% of the energy. There would also be onshore wind turbines. There would be rooftop solar photovoltaic installations. There would be concentrated solar photovoltaic plants, et cetera. I'm not going to go through all of the permutations of it. But this is not kind of, if I may, your 1970s back to the land, backyard, do-it-yourself, whole earth catalog plan. And this plan is beginning to edge into the political discussion. There was a front page Sunday Times Review article by the wonderful Elizabeth Rosenthal about this maybe 6 weeks ago. And if this is going to be done democratically and appropriately, then it's going to have a very strong left component. Because left to the rest of the political culture, not the left, it's going to come in a particular form, and I don't need to go into the details of what that's going to be. So this is sort of a heads up about that. But going very, very quickly here, I'm here to talk about a carbon tax, and my button, Tax Dirty Energy, sort of says it all. It's a fundament of economics that when there is a bad and we want to reduce the use and the prevalence of the bad, we do it far more efficiently, effectively, and rapidly by raising the price of the bad than by subsidizing some, many, or all of the conceivable alternatives to that bad. And I wish I had a whole 10 minutes or an hour to discuss with you, how that comes about. You can even see that with cigarettes. The reduction in cigarette use in the United States has come about through, many initiatives, and in fact, regulations banning them in, here, and, in larger places has had a huge impact on that. But so has raising the price of cigarettes, as opposed to subsidizing alternatives to cigarettes like lifesavers, chewing gum, pacifiers, whatever. And the same, again, not really enough time to go into that in detail, but as Jim Hansen says, as long as dirty energy is cheap, and it's cheap because those costs, its costs, are not internalized into the price, we are never going to be able to get off of them. They're going to be too available for everybody. And maybe just a little example on that. Refrigerators. The average refrigerator in the United States now uses about 2/3 less electricity per cubic foot than 30 years ago. A terrific advance wrought by wonderful people at environmental groups and the American Council for the Energy Efficient Economy, et cetera, who fought tooth and nail the appliance manufacturers, and a terrific story that needs to be sort of more widely told. But if that is the only way that we're going to reduce electricity for cooling, it can only go so far, because people have bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger refrigerators. And then even if there were a limit on that, well, they would have a second one. And you can imagine that the wealthy ones, even if somehow each home could only have one refrigerator, you can imagine how well that would go over in Congress. Well, then, the rich would begin to have cooling rooms. In fact, maybe they already do. They'd have their own meat lockers that they would go into, but it wouldn't just be for meat, it would be for milk and everything else that needs to be refrigerated. And then the rest of us would begin to feel unvalorized and marginalized because we don't have that as well. The gaming that would go on and does go on because we don't appropriately price energy and because we don't tax dirty energy is pervasive and profound. Anyway, that's my first point of 8, and now I only have 3 minutes left, maybe 2, to make the other points about a carbon tax. Okay. So the first point is that it's essential. The second is that it has to be large. It has to be really big. It can't be token. It can't be small. It has to drive investment and drive behaviors and drive cultures and drive what is valorized and what is not. And ultimately, it's not that I have anything against sort of soccer leagues and, that kids who play soccer get to compete against the best kids in the rest of the state, but ultimately it's going to have to become not the norm anymore to drive the kids 100 miles to, the regionals, somewhere else. There's going to have to be different ways of competing and different ways of having those wonderful, competitive sports, and I could go on and on. The example of having to fly across the country to your third cousin's nephew's bar mitzvah or confirmation because airfare is cheap. Well, once it's not cheap, maybe that won't have to be quite as essential anymore. So second is large. Third, it has to be transparent. It can't be a hide the price thing as in cap and trade. To drive investment, especially not just at the household level, but at the industrial level and at the institutional level, the price has to be transparent. Fourth, there has to be a trajectory toward that higher price that is fair and ethical. We can't, even if I ran the world, I would not start next year with a very high carbon tax because that would obsolesce a huge amount of the capital stock of the United States, ex-urban homes, all large, vehicles, patterns of culture and patterns of behavior, things that are going to have to be phased out and changed, but we all need time to make the investments and to adapt the culture differently to adapt to the higher price, not the higher cost. The cost is there and we're paying it, but the higher price of energy. So that trajectory has to be sort of steady, predictable, and rising. Then we come to what is the revenue going to be used for? And there are 2 different models, actually 3 different models of what the revenue would be used for. There is, and this is so simplistic, I hate to be uttering it, but if you will, the left, progressive, even socialist model of, well, my goodness, you take the revenues from a carbon tax and you invest it in the renewable energy and in the public transportation and in the bicycle lanes and all of the alternatives. And yet I have to say, that at the Carbon Tax Center, which I co-founded half a dozen years ago and run on a shoestring, here in New York City, that's not what we want to see, or it's not what we advocate for. If we had a different kind of society, we would probably be perfectly happy advocating for that. But rather, we believe politically that the carbon tax has to be revenue neutral, or nearly so, in order to be able to bring business and the right wing into a carbon tax political coalition. And the 2 ways to do that are through tax swaps or the James Hansen fee and dividend. The dividend system is simply that we take the carbon tax revenue pie, and every month, well, this is tricky. Is it every American? Is it every person living in America? Because that's not the same thing. Is it every household? Fraught with important issues and problems, but that every participant in the society gets an equal share, so that Warren Buffett and Sheldon Adelson and I and you all get the same dividend. If we do that, then at least 2/3 of American households come out better off because of the skewness of energy consumption in our society. So that's the revenue issue. Okay, 6, so 3 more. Where is such a carbon tax happening? I'm not going to cite Norway for some very good reasons, as you'll hear in a minute, or even the other democracies of Northern Europe, because their carbon taxes are not really explicit carbon taxes. They take high gasoline taxes, which, bless their hearts, they've had for 40 years, and it's been a godsend and a terrific thing for their societies, their urban areas, et cetera. And then they ex post facto label them as carbon taxes. There's nothing really wrong with that. But the best model that we see is the one in British Columbia, which went into effect in mid-2008 at about $10 per ton of CO2. It went up by $5 per ton in each of the next 4 years, and so finally a year ago it hit its plateau of $30 per ton. Now, that's not nearly the level that we have to get to, but for a province, a part of a country, that's quite admirable. And the British Columbia, compared to the rest of Canada, since 2008 has enjoyed and has experienced greater economic growth and a big decrease in emissions compared to the rest of Canada. So that is a success story in British Columbia. You can read about that on the Carbon Tax Center website. Just Google Carbon Tax Center. 7, what is the political path for a carbon tax in the United States? Congress, and I've been working, we try to influence Congress. It's obviously fraught with peril, difficulty, and frustration. And we think that for the next several years, the states are going to be a better laboratory for a carbon tax. Now, it can't be at a high level in any one particular state because of border and competitiveness issues, but at least it can become a template for national action. And we even believe, looking at the spectacular success of the marriage equality movement. The Defense of Marriage Act was Clinton, president, signed it in 1998, and for years, on a national level, the idea of same-sex marriage was completely, impossible. And what happened is that a new organization, Freedom to Marry, and this, again, totally oversimplified, but came into existence, identified certain states where progress might be able to be made, got messaging, invested resources, got organizers, and now, lo and behold, what is it, a dozen states that have freedom to marry, and this is clearly moving across the country without anything on the federal level. And so we are beginning to pattern carbon tax campaign organizing after this terrific nascent or in progress success. And so finally, is a carbon tax fair? Is it left? Is it socialist? I'm going to leave that to the philosophers and people with better brains about these things than I. I only sort of pick out what I want to work on and try to make it happen. I sort of did that with bicycling advocacy in New York City, and people would argue the theory about it. And 25 years ago, we sort of went to work in the streets, and a quarter of a century later, we feel that we've got somewhere. But is it fair to nature to unprice the use of fossil fuels and to not price the climate disruption that we, as human beings are wreaking upon the ecosphere? Is it fair to communities what we're doing now? Is it fair to persons what we're doing now? No, and I will not try to argue that a carbon tax is inherently fair or even is going to be done fairly in this unfair society, but it will make things less unfair, I believe, and it is essential and it is up to the left to invest a carbon tax with fairness and equity.